so I'm sitting in the middle, I feel like I should be I'm like the marriage counselor or something here. But I was wondering, maybe Max, since you're essentially like a historian of cypherpunk culture, if you could tell us some of the lesser known and interesting aspects of cypherpunk.
Yeah, I think, we can kind of ground the context of what we're going to talk about for the rest of the panel in this, right? So I think one of the kind of very under-discussed elements of cypherpunk and cyberpunk as well is like this, the ethos is historically very based on actually like egalitarianist thought, rooted in kind of like a lot of, I suppose, broadly like anarcho-organizational stuff as well. So we can actually, you can go back to the writings of even someone like Pierre Proudhon, who was like in the 1800s, really talking about self-governing communes, talking about like contract-based organizational planning before all of the kind of contracts and technology that we're thinking of now, just like how can communities actually meaningfully self-organize without having authority and coercion as like a principle of enacting that, right? And there's a lot of discussion of decentralizing power that actually predates cryptography, right? Cryptography was kind of that was the big switch that kind of really readjusted the asymmetry of power between the state and individuals in the state, or the state and kind of smaller communities. But like really all of this discussion really predates crypto. But cryptography was kind of the crux of that shift. And we shouldn't forget that. And even if we're looking at stuff from the 70s and the early 80s, people like Diffie and Hellman, the fathers of public key cryptography, they were put this into the public domain to create a shared secret over a non-confidential channel. Right? I think to all of us now, we kind of forget how actually radical that is and that was. How do you actually make a basis for shared secret communication in an environment that you can't trust? David Chaum, writing essays that had some of the hardest titles in 1979, Untraceable Electronic Mail, Return Addresses, and Digital Pseudonyms. How do you communicate privately? All of this stuff has been around for decades. And these were cryptographers who were really focusing in on the lack of agency that individuals had in a world that to us is now kind of the default, but back then they could see the kind of rapid encroachment of what he actually referred to as dossier society, which I think is also like a wonderful way that we can also kind of view what's going on now. You can go from this to Timothy May and his kind of tronyms in crypto-anarchy, very prescient when we're talking about the necessity for anonymous communication. This led to stuff like agorism, so the work of Samuel Conker III. So really, which kind of brings it back full circle, right? We were I started talking about Proudhon, and now agorism is really like, okay, cool. With cryptography, how do you make kind of dual power? How do you do a counter economy? How do you do a parallel society that is more based on market structures rather than maybe some of the more like anarcho strains of thought, but still there. And I want to finish off by talking, like, for this like historical context, talking about Jude Mulhoon, who's like criminally underrepresented, also known as St. Jude, founding member of the Cypherpunks mailing list, civil rights activist her entire life, made the first public bulletin board system that sat in the People's Computing Center in San Francisco, and just some quotes. So she saw hacking as a martial art, a way of defending against politically correct politicians, overly intrusive laws, bigots, and narrow-minded people of all persuasions, and as the clever circumvention of imposed limits, whether imposed on by your government, your own skills, or the laws of physics. And I think that's like the historical bed that I want to, kind of revitalize to everyone.
Nice. So maybe I'll just talk about what I think of the neo-cypherpunk, since we have this new terminology that's come into existence. I mean, I guess my tap the sign thing is always that Ethereum or any other blockchain is not a company, right? So it's a polycentric system. It's just a fancy academic way of saying that there are multiple decision makers who take each other into account. And what the function of this system is to, let's say from a cultural perspective, is to enable a pluralist community. Now, pluralist in the cryptography type way, as opposed to, let's say, hyper-liberal, vague sense. So regen, degen, pragmatists, and cypherpunks all live side by side, but maybe at a distance. But at the heart of this, there are ineliminable values. So there are like values that are non-negotiable, amongst which I would typically consider decentralization, permissionlessness, censorship resistance, credible neutrality. And so if these didn't exist, so if we imagine that there's an Ethereum that does not inscribe these values, or a blockchain of your choice that does not inscribe these values, then it would no longer be recognizably itself. So from that view, like cypherpunk or neo-cypherpunk is effectively the core. It is the very reason for what we're doing. Now, I guess maybe as a way to lead into our modern Jude, which would be Rachel Rose, we see in recent times this convergence of explaining cypherpunk values in terms of crops. And I guess this is maybe something I'd be interested in you guys, what your perspective is. So with crops, there is this, I guess, reconceptualization or reinterpretation that's happening. So we have a moment where this acronym has been decided upon. It's a semi-formal endorsement from the Ethereum Foundation, etc. But it means that values that have long been understood, let's say, if I said decentralization to cypherpunks of the 80s and 90s, or even 2000s, I think most of them would typically understand this to mean something like power is radically distributed as much as possible. But in the blockchain variant that we have today, it means something like the walkaway test, which is a term that Vitalik introduces in Make Ethereum Cypherpunk again. So that's one of the reconceptualizations. We also see the raising of censorship resistance. So that now has a first among equals. They're all supposed to be equal, but actually, ultimately because of Tornado Cash, we have a political situation where the significance of censorship resistance has actually displaced decentralization, such that people now say decentralization is the means toward the ends of censorship resistance. So I'm kind of wondering then, Rachel Rose, what you think of all this reconceptualization that's happening.
Yeah, for sure. So I think we're living at a really kind of interesting, pivotal moment in crypto, where we're having this period of kind of soul searching. And it's not by accident that there's a cypherpunk revival conversation happening at the same time as crypto is kind of facing its, I think personally, and I've seen a few of them, its worst bear market that it's ever experienced, where the sense of conviction is like really low. There's like a really, even among crypto fundamentalists, there's like a sense of fatigue. I get all the time like these last conferences, people saying things like this to me, like, I'm sick of crypto, to be honest, And this is coming from people who have made this their adult lives for, a decade. So, that's significant, because the last major bear market we had, there is a sense of like, okay, the world doesn't believe in us, but we believe in ourselves, and we know this is going somewhere. We have vision of where this is going, and like there is a sense of momentum and a sense of drive and belief, conviction. That's kind of been shaking, but at the same time, we do have this sense of like a cypherpunk revival. So a renewal of interest in privacy. Zcash, Monero are pumping. They're like one of the only coins that have like gone against the bear market trend. And simultaneously in all these different blockchain communities, even ones that we would say are like typically sort of like the least cypherpunk imaginable, like Solana, are having these cypherpunk revival moments, right? There's like a big privacy conversation happening, because simultaneously people are recognizing that we've lost our way. We've lost like the original kind of driving principles that gave the space its uniqueness and its momentum and its identity. And so there's a desire to return to that, but there's also a kind of sense of questioning, like, where did we go wrong? And I think the missing link really in like the kind of whole cypherpunk imaginary, something that crypto failed to fulfill, is strong, like uncompromising anonymity. So I think if the neo cypherpunk means anything, if cypherpunk now today means anything, it means like to bring back like that original vision, which is like all of these full transparency was a mistake. You know, like we need to undo like surveillance-based blockchains. We need to return to the vision of privacy, anonymity at the base layer, not something that's hacked on top as an afterthought. And I think what's really important if we're doing a cypherpunk revival is that we do it authentically. So it's not just like we're talking about all these amazing ideas from the 80s and 90s and earlier, you know, as Max pointed out, goes back a long time. We're not just talking about these ideas and creating like a romantic, fake world in our minds as like some kind of cope to like tell a story about what we're doing, and then we're doing something very different, like creating like on-chain surveillance apparatuses, which is like pretty much what crypto is today, right? So it's like it's important that we try to align this vision with the actual stuff that we're doing in real life, you know. So like authentically implementing cypherpunk imagination through privacy technology, through the insistence of free and open source software, and like really taking an uncompromising approach to that and being self-critical, you know, looking around at the kinds of tools that we're using and promoting and, you know, creating, and asking ourselves, like, you know, is this authentically cypherpunk or not? You know, I think if we ask that question, we ask that question to crypto in general, we end up sort of like throwing out more than half the industry. I mean, like we're talking 98% of crypto. So, you know, I think that this soul searching is also like, it's also, you know, an opportunity for a cleanse. And also, I will just say that if we're doing a cypherpunk revival, we're not just sort of like, it shouldn't just be a romantic return where it's like nostalgia, but, you know, it's also like we're recreating cypherpunk for today, right? So we're like questioning, where did cypherpunk go wrong, and what does it mean to be doing cypherpunk today? And so in this process, in this like creation process, what I think is like, okay, like where did cypherpunk go wrong? I think it didn't go hard enough. Like it wasn't extreme enough. So like that's why it's like we haven't achieved the vision we set out to do in the 90s. It's like, so really, you know, neo-cypherpunk, I think it needs to go much harder. It needs to be, it needs to push cypherpunk to its absolute limits. That's where I want to see it taken to. So some of the conversations around neo-cypherpunk today, for me, they don't fulfill that, but they should and they can. You know, we just need to push them a bit harder and be uncompromising in our vision.
Very acceleration is the... Maybe I can give a little bridge kind of with this question that you raise around unconditional privacy. So, I mean, that story of how this occurs, right? So I think the question, make Ethereum cypherpunk again, the obvious response is, was Ethereum ever cypherpunk at all, right? So that's a question. A question I guess we're asking here, or you're asking here is, were we ever cypherpunk in the beginning? So like being neo-cypherpunk almost seems like, you know, this is something that never really existed, that we never really, we tend to romanticize and fantasize about it. But in terms of this story of unconditional privacy, mostly this is coming from the work of P.K. Versaccio. So he has this Ethereum cypherpunk manifesto. And this document, which I'd encourage everyone to read, but I would also encourage everyone to read his Road to Self-Sovereignty. It's effectively an attempt to outline all of the tasks that would be required in order to implement privacy at a blockchain which didn't begin from pure anonymity. So if you don't begin with unconditional privacy, you effectively create for yourself this like extremely complicated, almost impossible seeming roadmap that, you know, would technically be extremely difficult to accomplish, but then also the will, right, the political, social, governance layer will, which he also does mention in that paper, would also require a huge amount of effort, such that if we wanted to change, like, let's say, Polkadot or Ethereum and turn them into unconditional anonymity at the base layer, it would almost have to be that their roadmaps were neo-cypherpunk extremism from the ground up. Like nothing else would be, everything else would be secondary. This would be the primary focus. Interestingly, unconditional privacy at the base layer is mentioned in the Ethereum Foundation mandate. So it is in there as a document, but then we have the selectively reveal aspect there. There's also a way in which we see, Vitalik had a tweet recently where enough narratives. We don't want to kind of keep discussing the narratives. What we should do is we should just kind of build Kohaku, just implement. So maybe there's some.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, one point that I kind of wanted to not to just be the history guy of this conversation, but like a point that you raised there of saying that to actually bring about this like end state, right, would require both a massive amount of kind of political will and political kind of organization as well as all of the technical stuff. But if you look at the history of all of the kind of privacy wins for the internet writ large, then that is how all of that stuff has also happened, right? We can't just be looking at technical solutions. Even something as kind of that we think of today as like, oh, it's TLS, it's fine. I can trust that the certificate of this website that I'm talking to or this HTTP endpoint is actually who they say they are, right? That was behind that was an immense amount of both technical and like fundamentally like bureaucratic work to get that into the fundamental backbone of the internet that we now just don't really think about. And or I suppose if you look at kind of the opposition to the Clipper chip in the US, right? There were technical arguments being made and a lot of that, but it was also kind of, I suppose we could term it as like extracurricular work that was being done by like cryptographers and activists across a broad swathe of attacks, right? There was a lot of stuff that was also happening like within the legal realm there. And that is, if we're talking about building culture, then we also have to be thinking outside of purely just building and technical stuff, right? Because it's also just more people that you can like bring into the fold. It's to go to existing, let's say, existing communities that may be sympathetic to essentially what we're kind of talking about here, both in terms of actually building stuff for them. And I think, this is what projects like Logos have been doing, and they've been doing it very, very well, like actually doing, outreach and helping communities with like, you have a specific problem, what is it and how can we help you? But we also shouldn't, I think, like shy away from the stuff that we could term as like bureaucratic or otherwise, right? Because it is actually, there is a massive grind and there is a massive uphill grind here. And from the perspective of privacy, all of this stuff sits on top of the existing internet that I don't think we talk about enough. Like, I work for NIM, so I think about network privacy all the time. So I think about this probably too much. But, even if we're talking about centralization with regards to an RPC provider, right, which is like has been discussed like ad nauseum over the past 10 years, that's still running on top of stacks that fundamentally aren't built with privacy in mind. So we have to also be thinking deeper, but like the tactics that work maybe up here are different from the ones that work down there. We need to have like a more collectivist approach to how we kind of slowly win this kind of, beat back this kind of encroaching surveillance state.
Yeah, maybe since this is kind of like a culture-first perspective, from my view, maybe this would be the extremist take on culture, but I only use the term social layer as applicable to the ideologically driven part of the community, because when, like the best way to see, let's say, a blockchain culture, it is a collection of stakeholders. There are values that hold us, that community together, let's say decentralization, and then you only really understand what let's say, the expectations of other people are, what kind of questions count as legitimate when they are, let's say when centralization, like someone tries to do something to do with centralization, which then causes the community to realize what those specific core values are. So when it comes to a blockchain, ultimately it's going to be the cultural, social layer that is going to be able to resist whatever attempt at capture comes. So good governance is basically good culture. Now, in the case of, let's say, neo-cypherpunk, that seems to suggest that in order to be, let's say, an extremist neo-cypherpunk community, which then turns the current blockchains we have into a, let's say, privacy first, like to actually get that unconditional privacy would effectively be, like the neo-cypherpunk extremists would actually have to like demographically change the cultures of these layer one blockchains. So is the best solution just to be a layer one unconditional anonymity chain with a strong culture from the beginning, like DarkFi?
Well, I think like crypto's kind of fascinating just like to look at objectively as like a mass kind of like, speed run evolutionary process of technology where we have like all of these different projects with all of these different opinions trying out different stuff, and like vast majority of them are failing. Some of them they find a niche and they do extremely well, but it's rare. But it's very interesting because you can study these examples and you can see, okay, like that one died. And DarkFi is privileged in that, we've been building for 5 years and we've seen many projects come and go. So we can kind of, look at that and try to build an analysis. And it seems like one of the big lessons is like, it's not enough for crypto just to build like better infrastructure, which was kind of like an earlier view, which is like, okay, we're going to make this perfect technology because we have this analysis, and it's like, obviously we lack this thing. But that's not enough. You actually need to have something that is like user facing, that's like a product, that like in order for, people to give a shit or your technology to be adopted in any significant way. So when we ask like the objective question, what is like the killer app of crypto? I think one possible answer to that, even though it makes a lot of crypto people uncomfortable, is actually USDT on Tron, which processes 20 billion on average per day in volume. And it's like this massive global phenomena with geopolitical significance. Like it's literally like impacting world events on a giant scale. So like, I think there's a lesson in that. DarkFi is kind of trying to learn from that. And in answer to your question though, like, I think, again, I'm thinking about this in evolutionary terms. So it's like, okay, you have projects like Ethereum, like Solana, that are trying to either innovate on privacy anonymity at the app layer, or, in the case of the ETH Foundation, they're trying to kind of create like a culture like around the core developers that promotes these values that will like eventually at some point lead to code probably. And so there's like different approaches. DarkFi's approach has been, we're a very small team. We don't have the capacity like Logos to do like this massive social, cultural, legalistic engineering project. Instead, we're just like, okay, we're like a tiny guerrilla group. We're just like, we're just going to do like the maximalist, most extremist neo-cypherpunk technology, and we're going to implement it in such a way that we think it can have massive network effect. And so that's what we're building. It's not just like a fully anonymous infra. It's also like a user-facing product, like a super app. So like we're hoping that that's enough that we can have this asymmetric kind of outsized impact, even though we're a very small team with constrained resources. That's how we've been approaching this problem for the past 5 years.
So does this imply that Justin Sun is the true archetype of a neo-cypherpunk extremist?
I mean, like Rose said, look at where this stuff is actually being used for a functional thing by people to get around stuff like blockades on currency distribution. It is being used in like Latin America, the Middle East. There's obviously problematic ways that like, with on and off ramps being bottlenecks, you lead to kind of scalping and stuff like that, but that's not really the point, right? That's something that can be improved upon. But exactly, like fundamentally, yes, they're the ones that have had like the biggest network effect in the world for this point. I wonder if we are also like kind of, I don't know, even the language we're using with this, right? Like, oh, is it a user-facing app, or is it just like a really cool thing that you showed to your friends and everyone goes, yeah, sick, right? Because that's also a change in, I don't know, I think we need to think in terms of building infrastructure which is censorship resistant to the kind of like powers that we're essentially planning for, but then also at the same time, like, the network effects partially also come because you show someone something and they go, oh yeah, that's rad, cool. Which is kind of, I mean, to your point earlier about like the social layer, I mean, really the social layer is where all of that stuff has been happening, right? Like where people have actually been brought in, where there is the most activity, where it's actually been kind of frothy in a way that you're like, oh, people are actually meaningfully like engaging with this thing. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from that as well. Yeah.
I'm questioning, I know we don't have much time, this is kind of a can of worms, but there's been, and actually this connects to Paul's research as well, but there's this tendency, there has been this tendency in the cypherpunk movement to kind of, it never really surpassed the level of like a very small kind of micro subculture. And given its roots in anarchism, as Max discussed, it kind of always retained this sort of antagonistic relationship to like mainstream power, where it's kind of like the underdog type figure that is like, yeah, it's like an antagonist, or its tactics are kind of subversion and like often inversion. We see this a lot in the cypherpunk sort of like symbols, like even the Darkfire logo. It's like an inverted triangle. So we're literally inverting the eye of providence, like, which represents like the eye of God on earth, like implemented by man, like the surveillance machine. So we're correcting it. But I guess the issue with this kind of like attitude, this like subcultural kind of like anarcho kind of like antagonist thing, is that it can end up getting trapped in that space, and it fails to like become a dominant force. It's always this kind of like this like small antagonizing force. What do you guys think of that?
Maybe I'll just make my kind of traditional comments on this. One is the crypto is a subculture that cannot accept it's a subculture. So it's had many, let's say, flirtations with the mainstream, and then it's the mainstream discovered the fact that we are at heart furries with money, right? We're this strange culture which goes from conference to conference with this. We're not really liked by kind of outsiders, but that there's this some kind of like underground subcultural element that makes us amenable to each other. So so I think my position on this has always been that it is not necessary for us to reach the mainstream, that we should see ourselves as a transglobal fraternity, and that when things do accelerate, when they do reach that situation where the kinds of skills that we have are necessary, people will recognize that for what it is, which is the ability to establish networks, the ability to send money anonymously, the ability to organize in very, very effective international manners. All of this will become important, but maybe we're never going to get it until the collapse occurs.
Yeah, I suppose going back to the Tron example, maybe they were, I think everyone here can everyone will have opinions about the technical architecture of Tron and the kind of like, decentralization aspect of it, right? But yeah, fundamentally they were there in the places that suddenly everyone needed this thing, and that was the option that was there. So there is an element to which I feel like the uptake of this stuff will also come in fits and starts as and when stuff becomes necessary. Right? Maybe if companies like Signal are forced to move out of the UK, or even actually, you see this, right? You see this with increasing, crackdowns on internet freedom. What happens in every single country? Everyone's searching for VPNs. The number immediately skyrockets, right? And we can kind of like, we can build this stuff so it is there when it is necessary, and that's kind of the big shove that sometimes will probably happen. We're not necessarily going to be, there will be a certain amount of kind of like prioritizing that we can do and bring people in, but you're laying rails for when they're suddenly necessary. I think kind of just something I wanted to kind of pick up on your point about the kind of defensive or the like antagonistic posture. I do think that's important, because fundamentally, and maybe this is the source of a lot of the kind of the fatigue as well, which is definitely something that I've also personally fallen into. It's like, if you spend too long inside your enemy's head, then where is I suppose, which is a question maybe in the last 10 seconds to actually finish on, right? Like, where's the generative drive to kind of, let 1,000 worlds bloom kind of thing? Where is that, rather than fundamentally always being reactive to like market forces, to all of the other pressures?
Totally. So I'll just conclude the panel by saying, I think this should be the goal of neo-cypherpunk, is to reorientate towards this more vitalist sort of affirmative mindset, where we're actually clear in the world we want to build, and we actually see ourselves as victorious, or potentially victorious, and not adopt a loser mentality where we're just playing catch up, or so in operating some kind of shadow of the surveillance state.